The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and orange, as the quiet hum of the city transitioned into its usual nighttime bustle. A police cruiser idled at the corner of 14th and Main, its lights off, blending into the dim surroundings. Inside, Officer Daniels adjusted his badge in the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the sidewalks with practiced precision. He prided himself on keeping the streets clean, even if his methods weren't always by the book. Tonight, he told himself, was just another night on patrol. Down the street, a young girl stepped out of a small corner store, her hands clutching a paper bag close to her chest. She couldn't have been older than 16, her bright, curious eyes darting nervously as she walked briskly down the sidewalk. Her hoodie was pulled tightly over her head, the fabric worn but clean, and her sneakers tapped softly against the pavement. She avoided eye contact with the occasional passerby, keeping her focus straight ahead. Daniels watched her through the windshield, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "What's she doing out here alone?" he muttered under his breath. To him, it didn't matter that she hadn't done anything suspicious. Her presence alone was enough to make him uneasy. He flipped on the cruiser's headlights, the sudden glare cutting through the growing darkness, and pulled out into the street to follow her. The girl quickened her pace as the car's headlights loomed behind her. Her chest tightened, and she clutched the bag even tighter. She knew the stories how these encounters often ended and fear crept into her steps. She turned into an alley, hoping to lose the car, but the cruiser followed, blocking her path. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Daniels barked as he stepped out of the car, his voice echoing off the brick walls. His hand hovered near his holster, though he hadn't drawn his weapon. The girl froze, her breath caught in her throat. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Let's see what you've got there," he demanded, pointing at the bag in her arms. She hesitated, clutching it protectively. "It's just groceries," she replied. "Groceries, huh? Out here at this time of night?" Daniel scoffed, stepping closer. He grabbed the bag from her hands and dumped its contents onto the ground. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few apples spilled out, rolling onto the dirty pavement. "See?" she said, her voice rising in frustration. "I told you." But Daniels wasn't convinced. To him, her defiance was reason enough to dig deeper. He radioed for backup, claiming she might be involved in suspicious activity. Within minutes, another cruiser arrived, its flashing lights illuminating the narrow alley. The girl was handcuffed and placed in the back seat, her protests falling on deaf ears. At the station, the air was thick with tension. The girl sat in a holding cell, her head bowed and hands trembling. Despite her fear, she held on to a sliver of defiance. She knew she didn't belong there, and she was determined to make that clear. Meanwhile, Daniels filled out his report, his tone dismissive as he recounted the incident to his colleagues. She was acting shady, wouldn't say where she was coming from. Had to bring her in, he said, shrugging as though it were routine. But as the night wore on, something began to nag at him. There was something familiar about her face, something he couldn't quite place. He shook off the feeling, attributing it to exhaustion, and returned to his paperwork. The next morning, the station buzzed with activity. Officers shuffled in and out, phones rang incessantly, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Daniels was finishing his third cup of coffee when the door to the captain's office swung open. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was tall, with a steely gaze that silenced the room as he walked. Daniels straightened in his chair, recognizing the man instantly. It was Mr. Caldwell, the precinct's new commissioner and a figure known for his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement. Daniels had only met him a handful of times but knew better than to cross him. Caldwell's eyes scanned the room, landing on Daniels. "Officer Daniels," he called, his voice firm but measured. "A word." Daniels stood quickly, his pulse quickening. He followed Caldwell into the office, the door closing behind them. "What's this I hear about a young girl being brought in last night?" Caldwell asked, his tone sharp. Daniels cleared his throat. "She was acting suspicious, sir. I thought it was best to bring her in." "Suspicious?" Caldwell repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Carrying groceries in her own neighborhood?" Daniels hesitated, realizing how hollow his justification sounded when laid bare. "Well, she was out late, and Caldwell held up a hand to silence him. "Did you even bother to check her story?" Daniels didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. "That young lady happens to be my daughter," he said, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable edge. "And she was walking home from visiting her grandmother." Daniels felt the blood drain from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Caldwell didn't wait for an explanation. "You overstepped, officer. And now, we have a serious problem." Before Daniels could process the weight of Caldwell's words, the office door opened, and the girl stepped in. Her eyes met Daniels's, and for the first time, he saw the fear and anger she'd been holding back. "I want him to apologize," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Caldwell nodded. "You'll do more than that, Daniels. You're going to make this right." Daniels swallowed hard, realizing that his actions had not only jeopardized his career but had also revealed a deeper truth about the biases he carried. As the girl stood there, her gaze unwavering, he knew there was no escaping accountability. The room fell silent as the weight of the moment hung in the air. What would happen next was unclear, but one thing was certain: this was a turning point, not just for Daniels but for everyone in that room. Daniels stood frozen, his throat dry as he struggled to find the right words. The weight of the commissioner's glare bore down on him, while the girl, her arms crossed and chin held high, looked at him with a mixture of anger and quiet defiance. It was in that moment he truly saw her, not as a faceless suspect, but as a teenager who had been wronged. The realization was like a punch to the gut, but he wasn't ready to admit it. "Not yet." Caldwell's voice broke the silence. "Daniels, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. My daughter trusted me when I told her she'd be safe in this city, that she could walk home without fear. And yet here we are." The words stung. Daniels glanced at the girl, her gaze unwavering. I didn't know she was your daughter," he muttered weakly, as if that somehow excused his actions. "That's the problem, officer," Caldwell replied sharply. "She shouldn't have to be my daughter for you to treat her with respect. Do you understand that?" Daniels nodded, though his mind raced. The guilt was beginning to sink in, but his instinct to defend himself clawed at him. "I thought I was doing my job," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Caldwell sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Your job is to protect and serve. Not to profile and intimidate. And not to make assumptions based on your own biases." The girl's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Why did you stop me?" she asked, her tone soft but filled with an edge of determination. "What made you think I was doing something wrong?" Daniels hesitated, the question hitting harder than he'd expected. What could he say? That her hoodie, her late-night walk, and the color of her skin had painted an unfair picture in his mind? That he hadn't even considered she might just be a kid running an errand? The truth was ugly, and for the first time, he didn't know how to face it. I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice barely audible. The girl raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "A mistake? That's all you've got?" Caldwell's sharp tone returned. "Daniels, you've got a long way to go to earn back any respect. For now, I suggest you start by listening." He turned to his daughter. "Go ahead, tell him." The girl took a step forward, her eyes locked on Daniels. "I visit my grandmother every week. She's old, and she needs help with groceries. Last night, I stayed a little longer because she wanted to talk. I didn't think it'd be a big deal to walk home. I never thought I'd get stopped, handcuffed, and thrown in a cell for it." Her words hung in the air, each one landing like a blow. Daniels felt his chest tighten, the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. He wanted to say something, anything, to fix what he'd done, but he knew no apology would erase the fear and humiliation she'd endured. Caldwell stepped in again, his tone measured but firm. "Officer Daniels, I expect a full report on this incident by the end of the day. And I'll be watching closely to ensure this doesn't happen again. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Daniels replied, his voice subdued. Caldwell nodded, then placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Come on, let's get you home." As they left the room, Daniels sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The station buzzed around him, but all he could hear was the girl's voice replaying in his mind. He had thought of himself as a good cop, someone who upheld the law and kept the community safe. But now he wasn't so sure. The hours that followed were a blur. Daniels sat at his desk, staring at the blank report form on his computer screen. He typed and deleted the same sentences over and over, struggling to find the right words. How did he explain something he barely understood himself? How did he justify actions he now realized were unjustifiable? As the sun dipped below the horizon again, the station began to quiet. Most of his colleagues had gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew on duty. Daniels stayed, unable to leave until he'd finished the report. But the more he wrote, the more he questioned everything he thought he knew. Why had he been so quick to assume the worst about that girl? Was it the neighborhood? The time of night? Or was it something deeper, something he'd never dared to confront before? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. In the days that followed, the incident didn't fade as Daniels had hoped. Words spread through the department, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Some of his colleagues offered support, insisting he'd just been doing his job. Others were less forgiving, their disapproving glances speaking volumes. But the hardest part was the reflection. Daniels couldn't escape the memory of the girl's face, the fear and anger in her eyes. He thought about her words, about how she'd described her grandmother, and the simple routine that had been so violently interrupted. It gnawed at him, forcing him to confront the biases he'd spent years denying. At home, Daniels found little solace. His wife noticed the change in him, the way he seemed distracted and irritable. "What's going on?" she asked one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "Work," he replied curtly, not meeting her gaze. She frowned but didn't press. She knew better than to push when he was in one of these moods. But even her silence couldn't drown out the storm brewing in his mind. A week later, Daniels found himself standing outside a modest brick house on the edge of the city. The address belonged to Caldwell, and Daniels had spent days debating whether to come. But something in him, maybe guilt, maybe a need for closure, had brought him there. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding as he waited. The door opened, and Caldwell stood there, his expression unreadable. "Officer Daniels," he said, his tone neutral. "What are you doing here?" I wanted to apologize," Daniels said, his voice shaky. "To your daughter. And to you." Caldwell studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Daniels entered, his eyes scanning the tidy living room. The girl was sitting on the couch, a book in her hands. When she saw him, her expression hardened. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone guarded. Daniels hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said finally. "For what I did. For assuming the worst about you. I was wrong." She didn't respond right away, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she set the book down and crossed her arms. "Why now?" she asked. "Why didn't you say that before?" Daniels took a deep breath, his chest tight. Because I was too proud. Too blind to see what I'd done. But I've been thinking about it, and I can't get it out of my head. You didn't deserve what happened. No one does. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The girl's expression softened slightly, though she didn't let her guard down completely. Caldwell watched the exchange, his arms crossed. Actions speak louder than words, Daniels. Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Daniels nodded, the question hitting home. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I want to do better. I need to. The girl studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. We'll see, she said, her voice quiet but firm. As Daniels left the house, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to walk it, one step at a time. Days turned into weeks, but Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that his apology, though sincere, wasn't enough. The looks he received at the station were a constant reminder of the incident. Some officers avoided eye contact altogether, while others gave him knowing glances that made his skin crawl. It wasn't lost on him that Caldwell's words had likely spread among the ranks. Daniels felt exposed, his reputation hanging by a thread. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk going through routine paperwork, a notification popped up on his computer screen. It was a department-wide memo, a mandatory seminar on community relations, spearheaded by none other than Commissioner Caldwell. Daniels stared at the email, his chest tightening. He knew this was more than a training session, it was Caldwell's way of holding the department accountable. When the day of the seminar arrived, Daniels entered the conference room with a sense of dread. The room was packed, officers seated shoulder to shoulder as Caldwell stood at the front, his presence commanding. Daniels felt the weight of every gaze as he slid into a seat near the back, hoping to blend in. But he couldn't escape the feeling that Caldwell's eyes lingered on him just a second too long. The seminar began with statistics, cold, hard numbers about racial disparities in policing. Caldwell's voice was steady as he presented the data, but his tone grew sharper when he shared real stories from the community. Daniels felt a knot form in his stomach as one particular story hit too close to home, a young black teenager wrongly accused and detained for simply walking home. It was a mirror to his own actions, and the shame burned deep. As the seminar continued, Caldwell invited community members to speak. A local pastor shared a heartfelt plea for change, while a mother recounted the terror her son felt every time he saw flashing lights behind him. The stories were raw, each one adding to the weight on Daniel's shoulders. He couldn't help but notice the uncomfortable shifts in his colleagues' seats, the way some avoided eye contact altogether. But for Daniels, there was no escape. Every word felt like it was directed at him. When Caldwell finally opened the floor for discussion, the room fell silent. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Daniels felt his heart pounding in his chest as he considered standing. The memory of Caldwell's daughter's glare still lingered in his mind, and he knew this was his moment to step up or stay silent forever. Taking a deep breath, Daniels stood. All eyes turned to him, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I want to say something, he began, his voice shaky. A few weeks ago, I made a mistake. I stopped someone who didn't deserve to be stopped. I acted on assumptions instead of facts, and I hurt someone in the process. The silence in the room was deafening, but Daniels pressed on. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened. About why I did what I did. And the truth is, there's no excuse. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. Caldwell's expression remained unreadable as Daniels continued. But an apology isn't enough. I need to do better. We all do. That's why I'm here, and that's why I'm listening. When he finished, the room remained quiet for a moment before Caldwell finally spoke. Thank you, Daniels. Accountability is the first step. Now let's talk about the next one. The seminar ended with a list of initiatives to improve relations between the department and the community. Daniels left the room feeling a mix of relief and determination, but he knew his journey was far from over. The real challenge lay ahead, improving his commitment through actions, not words. That evening, as he drove home, Daniels found himself taking a detour through the neighborhood where he'd stopped Caldwell's daughter. He parked his car and stepped out, walking the streets with a new perspective. The people he saw weren't just strangers anymore, they were part of a community he was supposed to serve. He felt the weight of his badge in a way he never had before, as both a symbol of authority and a responsibility to do better. As the days went on, Daniels began volunteering for community events. He attended town hall meetings, helped with local cleanups, and even participated in youth mentorship programs. It wasn't easy, there were plenty of skeptical glances and whispered comments, but he kept showing up, determined to rebuild the trust he had broken. One evening, Daniels found himself at a community center, helping organize a workshop for teenagers. As he handed out supplies, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Caldwell's daughter. She was sitting with a group of friends, her eyes narrowing when she saw him. Daniels felt his chest tighten, but he approached her cautiously. "Hey," he said softly. "I didn't know you'd be here." She shrugged, her tone cool. "I didn't know you'd be here either." Daniels hesitated, unsure of what to say. I'm trying to do better," he said finally. "I know I can't change what happened, but I'm trying to make things right." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Actions speak louder than words," she said, echoing her father's earlier advice. Then she turned back to her friends, leaving Daniels standing there with a mix of hope and uncertainty. As the workshop continued, Daniels found himself drawn into conversations with the teenagers, listening to their stories and sharing his own. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. By the end of the night, he noticed Caldwell's daughter watching him from across the room, a flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe curiosity in her eyes. But just as Daniels began to feel a sense of purpose, a new challenge emerged. Rumors of a misconduct investigation began circulating at the station, and Daniels found himself under scrutiny once again. He didn't know who had filed the complaint, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Every effort he made to rebuild trust now seemed fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter it completely. The investigation brought tension to a boiling point. Daniels found himself questioned about every detail of the incident, his actions dissected and scrutinized. His colleagues offered little support, some even distancing themselves out of fear of being associated with him. It felt like a test, one that would determine not only his career but also his character. As the days dragged on, Daniels grew increasingly anxious. He replayed the events in his mind over and over, questioning every decision he made. The pressure was suffocating, but he refused to give up. He knew this was his moment of truth, the culmination of everything he'd learned and everything he stood for. One evening, Daniels received a call from Caldwell. The commissioner's voice was calm but firm. "We need to talk," he said. "Meet me at the station." Daniels felt his heart race as he hung up. The call felt ominous, as if the final judgment was about to be delivered. As he drove to the station, the city lights blurred past him, his mind racing with possibilities. Would he lose his badge? His career? Or had Caldwell seen something in him worth saving? When Daniels arrived, the station was quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an eerie stillness. He walked into Caldwell's office, his palms sweaty and his throat dry. Caldwell was seated at his desk, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," Caldwell said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Daniels obeyed, his heart pounding in his chest. The room felt suffocating, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Caldwell leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "What happens next," Caldwell said, his voice low and steady, "is up to you." Daniels sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing as he tried to decipher Caldwell's words. The air in the room felt heavy, each second stretching into eternity. "What happens next is up to you." The phrase replayed in his head like an echo, its meaning just out of reach. Caldwell's steady gaze felt like it could pierce through every layer of doubt, fear, and regret that Daniels carried. Caldwell finally broke the silence, his tone deliberate. "The investigation uncovered something unexpected. It's not just about your actions that day." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It's about patterns, Officer Daniels. Not just yours, but systemic ones. You've been in this department long enough to know that problems like this don't start or end with one person." Daniels blinked, trying to grasp where this was headed. "Sir, I know I've made mistakes. I've owned up to them." "I'm trying to." Caldwell raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not questioning your intentions, Daniels. I'm questioning whether you're ready to handle what's coming next." His voice softened, but the intensity remained. "Because the truth is, this department isn't just under scrutiny for what you did. It's under scrutiny for what we've allowed to happen for years. The public isn't looking for apologies anymore, they're looking for accountability. Real accountability." Daniels felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire department, the culture he had been a part of, consciously or not. He thought back to all the times he had turned a blind eye to questionable behavior, chalking it up to the way things were. Those moments now felt like anchors pulling him down, each one a missed opportunity to do better. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying Daniels with an intensity that made him squirm. "I'm offering you a choice," he said finally. "You can keep your head down, do the bare minimum, and hope this all blows over. Or you can step up. Help me change the narrative. But know this, if you choose the second path, it won't be easy. You'll face backlash from your colleagues, from the public, maybe even from yourself. But it's the only way forward." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door to Caldwell's office swung open. A young officer, visibly flustered, stepped in. "Sir, we have a situation," she said hurriedly. "It's about the complaint. There's more to it than we thought." Caldwell's brow furrowed as he gestured for her to continue. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone sharp. The officer hesitated, glancing at Daniels before continuing. "The person who filed it. She's claiming there's evidence video footage that contradicts the initial report. She's saying it proves systemic bias, not just in this case, but across multiple incidents." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. Video footage? He hadn't even considered the possibility. His mind raced with questions. Who had the footage? What did it show? And why was it surfacing now? Caldwell's expression hardened, his focus shifting back to Daniels. "Looks like your choice might come sooner than expected," he said grimly. "Let's go." The three of them made their way to the briefing room, where a small group of officers had gathered around a monitor. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken anxiety. On the screen was a paused video, the grainy quality suggesting it had been recorded on a phone. Caldwell motioned for the officer controlling the playback to start it. The footage began with a shaky view of a street corner, the perspective from someone standing behind a car. Daniels recognized the location immediately. It was where he'd stopped Caldwell's daughter. His heart sank as he watched himself on the screen, his posture stiff, his tone harsh. The camera caught every word, every movement, exposing the raw reality of the encounter. But then the perspective shifted. Another figure appeared in the frame, an older man walking past, his face etched with concern. He stopped and pulled out his phone, recording the interaction from a different angle. This second perspective showed details Daniels hadn't even noticed at the time: the girl's trembling hands, the way her voice wavered as she answered his questions. It was undeniable. The video continued, showing the man following up with another officer at the scene, pointing out what he perceived as unfair treatment. The officer dismissed him, brushing off his concerns without even looking up. The footage ended abruptly, but the room remained silent, the weight of what they had just seen settling over everyone like a cloud. Caldwell turned to Daniels, his expression unreadable. "This changes things," he said simply. "The community won't just see this as a single mistake. They'll see it as proof of a larger problem. And they'll demand answers." Daniels felt the walls closing in around him. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and his role in the unfolding crisis was more complicated than ever. But amidst the panic and shame, a small voice inside him whispered that this was his moment to make things right, not just for himself, but for everyone affected by the system's flaws. Caldwell broke the silence, his voice firm. "We need to get ahead of this. Daniels, you're going to be part of the response team. You'll speak directly to the community, answer their questions, and take responsibility for your actions. But more importantly, you'll listen. And you'll make it clear that we're committed to change." Daniels nodded, though his throat felt tight. He wanted to believe he could handle the challenge, but doubt gnawed at him. Could he truly regain the trust he had lost? Could he help rebuild the department's reputation without losing himself in the process? As the meeting adjourned, Daniels lingered in the room, staring at the now blank screen. The images from the video played over and over in his mind, a stark reminder of how far he still had to go. But he also felt a spark of determination. This wasn't just about salvaging his career, it was about proving to himself, and to others, that change was possible. He left the station that night with a new sense of purpose, though the road ahead felt daunting. The video had brought a new level of scrutiny, and the pressure to act swiftly and decisively was immense. As he drove home, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Caldwell, outlining their next steps, a public forum, set for the following evening. Daniel's stomach churned at the thought of standing in front of an audience, bearing his flaws for all to see. But he knew it was necessary. The next day, Daniels prepared himself for what was to come. He reviewed talking points, rehearsed responses, and tried to steel himself against the fear threatening to overwhelm him. By the time he arrived at the community center, the room was already packed, the energy electric with anticipation. As he stepped onto the stage, Daniels felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. Caldwell introduced him briefly before stepping aside, leaving Daniels alone under the harsh glare of the spotlight. He gripped the microphone tightly, his palms sweaty, and took a deep breath. "I know I'm not who you expected to see tonight," he began, his voice steady but low. "And I know many of you are angry. You have every right to be. What you saw in that video, it was wrong. And I take full responsibility for my part in it." The crowd murmured, their reactions mixed. Daniels pressed on, pouring every ounce of sincerity he could muster into his words. "But I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to be part of the change this community deserves." As he spoke, Daniels scanned the room, his eyes landing on familiar faces, the pastor from the seminar, the mother who had shared her story, and finally, Caldwell's daughter. She stood near the back, her expression unreadable, but her presence alone was enough to keep him grounded. The questions began, each one more pointed than the last. Daniels answered as honestly as he could, his voice trembling at times but never wavering in its resolve. The crowd's reactions were varied, some nodded in understanding, while others remained skeptical. But through it all, Daniels felt a shift. Slowly, the walls between him and the community began to crack, just enough for a glimmer of hope to shine through. But as the night wore on, a voice from the back of the room cut through the noise. "What about the rest of the department?" the man asked, his tone sharp. "It's not just about one officer. What are you going to do about the system?" The question hung in the air, heavier than anything Daniels had faced so far. He glanced at Caldwell, who gave him a small nod. This was the moment that would define not just his future, but the departments as well. Daniels gripped the edge of the podium, the man's questions still echoing in the room. The silence was heavy, charged with anticipation, as every eye in the room focused on him. He felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself but for every officer in the department. This wasn't just about his personal accountability, it was about dismantling a system that had failed too many for far too long. He took a deep breath and met the man's gaze directly. "You're right," Daniels said, his voice firm. "It's not just about me. It's about a system that allowed this to happen, that allowed too many voices to go unheard. And changing that system starts here, with transparency, with accountability, and with action." The room erupted into murmurs, but Daniels wasn't finished. "I know words aren't enough," he continued. "That's why Chief Caldwell and I have committed to an independent review of our department's policies and practices. We're bringing in outside experts, people who can see the cracks we've ignored for too long. And we'll report back to you, this community, because you deserve to know the truth." The murmurs grew louder, some voices skeptical, others cautiously hopeful. Caldwell stepped forward then, placing a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder. "This isn't just his fight," Caldwell said, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "This is our fight. All of us. And it won't be easy, but it's necessary." Before the crowd could respond, the back doors of the hall swung open, and a figure stepped in. Daniel's heart stopped when he recognized the woman Caldwell's daughter. She walked confidently to the front, her presence commanding attention, and faced the crowd. "I'm not here to defend what happened," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "What Officer Daniels did that day was wrong. But I've watched him since then. I've seen him listen, reflect, and take steps to make amends. That doesn't erase the harm, but it's a start. And it's more than we've seen from others." The crowd was silent, her words hanging in the air. Then she turned to Daniels, her eyes locking onto his. "I didn't come here for an apology," she said. "I came here to hold you accountable, to make sure you don't just talk about change but live it." Daniels nodded, swallowing hard. "I promise," he said quietly, but firmly, "I will." The room seemed to hold its collective breath as her words sank in. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began, hesitant at first but growing stronger. It wasn't unanimous, but it was something, a sign that trust, however fragile, was beginning to form. Just as the tension seemed to ease, Caldwell's phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me," he muttered, stepping aside to take the call. Daniels watched as Caldwell's expression shifted from concern to something darker, shock, maybe even fear. When Caldwell returned, his face was pale. "We have a situation," he said, his voice low but urgent. "It's about the footage." "There's more." Daniels felt his stomach drop. "More? What do you mean?" Caldwell shook his head. "It's not just the video you saw. There's another angle, another recording, and it shows something we missed." The room buzzed with renewed tension as Caldwell motioned for the tech team to connect his phone to the projector. Moments later, a new video played on the screen. The footage showed the same scene, but this time, the focus was on the officer standing in the background, specifically, one officer who seemed to be giving orders. Daniel's blood ran cold as he recognized the man, Lieutenant Garner, a veteran officer known for his tough, no-nonsense approach. The video showed Garner gesturing sharply, directing the younger officers, including Daniels, to act. His voice, though faint, could be heard clearly. "Make an example of her. Let them know we're not playing around." Gasps rippled through the room as the implication became clear. Daniels wasn't acting alone that day. He had been following orders that now seemed calculated and deliberate. The crowd's mood shifted, anger bubbling to the surface, not just at Daniels but at the deeper betrayal the video revealed. Daniels turned to Caldwell, his voice shaking. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." Caldwell held up a hand, his face grim. "I believe you," he said quietly. "But this changes everything." The crowd erupted into chaos, voices shouting questions, accusations, demands. Caldwell stepped forward, raising his hands to call for order. "This is exactly why we need transparency," he said firmly. "The truth is coming out, and we will not hide from it. Lieutenant Garner will be investigated, and if these actions are confirmed, he will face consequences." The crowd began to settle, but the tension was palpable. Daniels felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. He had thought he was taking the first step toward redemption, but now it seemed like the battle was only beginning. As the meeting ended and the crowd dispersed, Daniels sat alone in the empty hall, his mind racing. The revelations had shifted the focus, but they didn't absolve him. If anything, they deepened his resolve to prove he could be part of the solution, not just another cog in a broken machine. The final twist came late that night, as Daniels prepared to leave. Caldwell approached him, his expression unreadable. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low. "The footage wasn't leaked by accident. It was sent to us anonymously." Daniels frowned. "Sent by who?" Caldwell hesitated before answering. "The man who filmed it. The one who stood up that day. He's been watching, waiting to see if we'd do the right thing. And he's not done yet." Daniels felt a chill. The man wasn't just a witness, he was a catalyst, a force pushing them all toward a reckoning they could no longer avoid. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, as Daniels sat staring at the file in front of him. The anonymous man who had filmed the second video had sent one last message, a letter addressed to both Daniels and Caldwell. It was a simple, handwritten note, but its words carried weight. The note read, "You can't undo the past, but you can change the future. This is your chance to prove that. Justice isn't just a word. Show us what it really means." Daniels felt a knot tighten in his chest as he read it over again. The man's words were both a challenge and an opportunity, and Daniels knew this was his moment to make things right. Caldwell stood beside him, his face grim but determined. They had spent the last several hours piecing together a plan to address what the videos had revealed, but they both knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, a press conference was held outside the precinct. Daniels, Caldwell, and other department leaders stood in front of a large crowd of reporters, community members, and activists. Cameras flashed, and microphones were held aloft as Caldwell stepped forward to speak. "This department has failed," Caldwell began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've failed this community, and we've failed the principles we are sworn to uphold. But today, we are taking the first step to rebuild trust, starting with full transparency and accountability." Daniels stepped forward next, his heart pounding. He scanned the crowd, spotting the faces of those he had wronged and those who had demanded change. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "Mistakes that hurt people, that betrayed the very values I claimed to stand for. But I'm here today to own those mistakes and to commit to making things right." He went on to explain the actions the department would take: an independent review of policies, a thorough investigation into Lieutenant Garner's conduct, and mandatory training programs focused on bias and de-escalation. It was clear these were not just symbolic gestures but concrete steps toward meaningful change. As Daniels spoke, he saw a familiar figure in the back of the crowd, the man who had filmed the videos. Their eyes met briefly, and the man gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a sign that the effort mattered. Over the following weeks, the department worked tirelessly to implement the promised changes. Daniels found himself in the thick of it, attending community meetings, listening to stories of pain and frustration, and working to bridge the gap between the police and the people they served. It wasn't easy. There were moments of anger, moments when it felt like the divide was too deep to cross, but there were also moments of connection, of shared humanity. One day, as Daniels left a community meeting, he was approached by Caldwell's daughter. She had been a vocal critic of the department, but had also shown a willingness to engage in dialogue. "You're different now," she said simply. "Not perfect, but different." Daniels nodded. "I'm trying," he said. "I know it'll take more than words to prove it." She smiled faintly. "Keep trying. It's a start." The investigation into Lieutenant Garner revealed a pattern of misconduct that had been overlooked for years. Garner was dismissed from the force, and charges were brought against him for abuse of power. His removal sent a strong message that no one was above accountability, not even those at the top. Meanwhile, Daniels worked to rebuild trust with the young woman he had wrongfully detained. Their initial conversations were tense, filled with raw emotion and unanswered questions. But over time, they began to find common ground. She agreed to join a new advisory board that would oversee the department's reforms, bringing her perspective and experiences to the table. One evening, as the board met to discuss their progress, Daniels found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The tension that once defined these meetings had given way to a sense of cautious optimism. People were speaking openly, listening to one another, and working together to create a better future. As the meeting ended, Caldwell pulled Daniels aside. "You've come a long way," Caldwell said. "But this work doesn't end. Not for you, not for any of us." Daniels nodded, his expression serious. "I know. This is just the beginning." Months later, the department held another press conference to update the community on their progress. This time, the mood was different. While there was still skepticism and lingering wounds, there was also a sense of hope. The changes were real, and they were starting to make a difference. Daniels stepped up to the podium once more, his heart full but steady. "We've learned a lot over the past year," he said. "We've learned that trust isn't given, it's earned. And we've learned that real change takes all of us, working together, even when it's hard." As he spoke, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been painful, filled with missteps and hard lessons, but it had also been transformative. He knew there was still work to do, but for the first time, he felt truly hopeful about the path ahead. The man who had filmed the videos never revealed his identity publicly, but his impact was undeniable. He had sparked a movement, forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. His actions reminded everyone, officers and community members alike, that change was possible, but only if they were willing to fight for it. As the press conference ended, Daniels stepped away from the podium and looked out at the crowd. He saw faces of determination, faces of resilience, faces of hope. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be,